Hello, everyone. I'm Marian Liu. I am the Director of Arts and Culture for Smart Growth America, and I am delighted to introduce this next panel, Cultural Organizing as Reclamation and Resistance. Here at SGA, we believe that the arts, creativity, and culture play a crucial role in smart growth and thriving communities as a force for building connection and power among community members, and by making manifest the often hidden, excluded, or erased knowledge, wisdom, stories, and traditions within communities. I'm very excited to hear from this group of community organizers, planners, and scholars whose work encompasses and exemplifies these values, and notably outside of historic urban ethnic enclaves, in the suburbs, in strip malls, reflecting the rapidly changing and evolving demographics of both the suburbs and of this country. So we're gonna get started right away with introductions, and I'm gonna start the first question and also ask you to introduce yourselves as you're answering. So how does equity show up in the work you do and why you do this work? And I'll start with Willow, and we'll just go down.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Willow Langamam. I am an associate professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland. So I teach and research along questions of racial inequality in changing neighborhoods. And so I look at questions of segregation, gentrification, and immigration, and how it plays out in the politics of development and redevelopment as neighborhoods change. So at the university, I hold a lot of hats. I'm an independent researcher, so I've written a couple books now, sort of thinking about questions of immigration and change, and racial inequality and gentrification in suburbs in particular. So I bring that context. I also bring my hat as director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, which is a network that started 3 years ago under my leadership at the university. And our mission at what we call SBAN is to help to prevent the displacement of small businesses, particularly BIPOC and immigrant-owned small businesses, which are those that are most vulnerable to displacement when neighborhoods gentrify. And why we started this initiative was really recognizing that the impacts of gentrification on neighborhoods are really holistic, right? It's not just residents that are being displaced. It is small businesses, it is the cultural institutions in a neighborhood, it is the political power that communities hold, and we need to be thinking about the different aspects of what is at stake when neighborhoods and residents and businesses are displaced from a neighborhood. So we started the initiative to really fill a gap in what we were seeing in terms of research, in terms of practice, and in terms of policy. And we've done that over the last several years in different ways. We call ourselves a community of practice because we're bringing together a network of different organizations that are in this space, whether that's a nonprofit advocate, a community-based organization, a technical assistance provider, an economic development agency, a community development financial institution, or a CDFI. Any of these organizations that touch small businesses and help to support their growth and their development and their stability, we care about giving them additional resources, additional networks, additional research that will help them to push policy and practice in this space. So that's the context that I'm coming from and with, and maybe I'll pass the mic to Manuel.
Thank you.
Thank you. And my name is Manuel Ochoa with Ochoa Urban Collaborative. So I'm a consultant. I started my own firm about 5 years ago in housing, planning, and community development, primarily because our work is holistic. I've worked in national organizations doing policy. I've worked at HUD and the federal government and local government. And I think in each place, I was kind of asked to put my brain in a box. It's like, We'd like you to work on planning, but not on housing policy. We'd like you to work on community development and not necessarily in this area. So our work is really holistic, and having worked over the years in different communities and seeing especially the impact in communities that have been disinvested, and especially communities of color, I really wanted to work at the local level and work with organizations directly. I think that's what inspires me the most to do the work, and so that's so I'm glad, I feel privileged to be able to do that. I also work with Dr. Willow Lungamam on the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network as a senior advisor. So it's also doing both, working with local organizations. And then in particular, which we'll be able to talk about more and during the panel, is with the Purple Line Corridor Coalition. So look forward to the conversation, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of the panel.
Hi, everyone. So I think I'm going to start off with the question of equity. What does that mean for me and the work that I do? We just want to make sure our immigrant communities of Atlanta are not left out. And I am the executive director. My name is Lily Pabian, of an organization, community-driven organization called We Love Buford Highway. And our mission is to preserve the multicultural identity of this corridor. It has been around for almost half a century. I grew up in this corridor. My father was one of the founding fathers of our Chinatown. And it's just a place of such deep importance. And our work is really about telling our stories, archiving, collecting, empowering our youth within our community, because there's been such a gap and such a lack of investment within our schools that are predominantly brown and immigrant children. We have an arts and culture deep commitment to highlighting all of our different customs, all of our different heritages, stories we bring to Atlanta. You know, arguably Buford Highway is the corridor that brought the Olympics to Atlanta. We are bringing FIFA. And you know, what's important to us in this space, of course, is our small businesses. You know, my parents were part of that entrepreneurial sort of founding communities, and it ebbs and flows. There are a lot of barriers, and there now is a point, particularly after COVID, in terms of this rapid response, this sense of urgency. We are being displaced. We are, I call it sort of attritional displacement, right? Whether it's because the schools are not serving our children, or the policies of starting a business for mom and pops is getting harder and harder. When we think about things like language and cultural perspectives and nuances, those are the things that our agency really works in terms from a grassroots level. So our communities are largely Latino communities, API communities, African diaspora communities, and we're here to really just support their needs and to ensure that they thrive. I'm really happy to be here.
My name is Jen Tran. I'm a founding member of the Viet Place Collective. We are a grassroots, all-volunteer advocacy group working to preserve the culture and uplift small businesses and work in anti-displacement of the Vietnamese community here in the DMV. We formed in response to a city redevelopment plan that our concern was the displacement of a majority Vietnamese cultural hub that is the Eden Center. It's the largest commercial and cultural hub on the East Coast. It's a place that means a lot to all of us personally. Some of our families have been here for decades. Some of our families own businesses here. So it's something that means a lot. It's us fighting for not just the buildings, the roof and walls of this place, the shopping center, but actually fighting for the soul of the people who make their livelihoods here, the families whose stories exist here. So we are working with the small businesses to connect our story to what is essentially what we see a much larger trend of gentrification across the country. This trend of jurisdictions going barely above the bare minimum to do what they see as equitable outreach, and what we see as really essentially tapping into the agency and power of these communities that exist, and we have visions for the future that we want to see. And so uplifting that, building community solidarity is our bread and butter. So small business technical support and cultural work of reclaiming our histories, sharing our history of displacement within the community, specifically Vietnamese displacement, displacement from the Vietnam War from the country originally, 60s and 70s, and then in this area, displacement from Arlington by the development of the metro. So here we are again in Falls Church, which is a suburb of DC, trying to stake our claim and reestablish the importance of our places and our people.
Awesome. I guess I'm going to start this next question with you, Jen, and we'll just come back around this other way. And I think you're already starting to answer this question, which is how has culture been essential in advancing equitable development in your work or in your community? And I think, just from hearing you talk, it's that there really isn't space in these processes, right? Like there isn't space. Like these processes are designed to almost strip culture out of the process. It's been designed that way to be so apolitical, acultural. So for you, right, how has culture been actually essential in, and how have you fought to ensure that it is relevant, it is meaningful, and that it is, again, essential to what we're all trying to achieve?
That's a really good way to address the question. Thank you. I think culture is essential to galvanizing solidarity between people and community. That is something that we noticed of watching the city planning process. There were so few people of color, there were so few immigrants, Vietnamese people at these city planning meetings, and there are pictures of our lion dances and our dragon gate, and they say that's enough cultural representation, and that's clearly not the case for us. And so I think capitalizing on cultural organizing is a way to build bonds, strengthen bonds within communities, whereas otherwise there could be a lot of divides. I think when we talk about communities that are being affected by development, it's really important to recognize that we're not a monolith. In the Vietnamese community, especially your work in Buford Highway, there's people across racial lines, political lines, educational and generational divides. So there are a lot of fractures that exist, and we don't all believe the same things about development and what would be good for the community. But when we can come along and tap into a shared cultural memory, this is our legacy, this is a reason that we're fighting on the same side, this is a reason, something to build upon and look towards the future. I think that's a really good place to land to, again, build that agency and neighborhood power in a really grassroots way that's not top-down of a jurisdiction or city planners assigning a certain cultural identity to a neighborhood and saying, this is who you are, we will work to protect it. Whereas it's a community actually coming together, looking across the aisle and saying, oh, this is something we have in common, this is something we want to protect together, what can we do together?
Cultural organizing for our organization is really about building trusts. I mean, you can't move or sort of impose these thoughts and ideas about policies and boundaries and representations without that level of trust. So for us, it's really about we see you, we understand, we want to get to know more about these different cultures because, to your point, it's not just one, Lunar New Year's for everybody, and everybody celebrates it the same way, right? I mean, and that's just one example, particularly in our Latino communities. We know there's so many different ethnic groups. We serve 3 cities. The south side is Brookhaven, but actually Buford Highway is a 30-mile state highway. It's a very linear community. And it's done that way because it's such a convenient in terms of access to transportation, and at a time affordability. It really was an affordable place, and we're starting to see those change. But we serve, our organization serves a 10-mile stretch, the closest to Atlanta. So it's Brookhaven, Chamblee, and Doraville. Chamblee has one of the largest Guatemalan communities. And, there is not those cultural nuances, the things that are different. I think it's really important to raise awareness because it builds that sense of engagement that, we want to know you authentically. And so I think for us, it's really about building that trust. Yeah.
I would agree with that. I think in the work of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, arts and culture were really the entryway into building trust. So I totally, wholeheartedly agree. When we started doing the work in small business anti-displacement, we really started the work right during the pandemic. So we had just started to gear up and starting to do outreach with all the restrictions that existed. So like here we are, and we're also associated with the University of Maryland. So we had the opportunity to build to have the engineering department create the protective equipment, that was running out. So we were going out to the community, and that's how we started. And we went to all the businesses, and of course they said, thank you very much. And that was it. We didn't really get into much more of a conversation with them about everything else we wanted to do. But it was really around arts and culture, and when we started talking about placemaking, placekeeping, and talking to them, because, to your point, Lily, that you were saying about that a lot of times they don't feel seen. And the Purple Line is a light rail line that's being built from New Carrollton, Maryland to Bethesda with 22 stops. And there are many different communities along the way, African American, Latino communities, Salvadoran, Guatemalan, Asian, all along the way, African, Caribbean. And I think a lot of times these communities don't get seen. And when a lot of people travel, they only travel to certain spaces, but they don't get the full breadth of what it represents. So arts and culture was really a way to bring it together, and the placemaking studio at the University of Maryland really did help us start the conversation and building those bridges. So.
Yeah, so I think when a neighborhood redevelops, there's a lot of ways in which culture plays and arts plays a central role. The process of gentrification is not apolitical, and it's not acultural, meaning that there is a politics to the process. There are policies that are put in place that further the process of redevelopment that is more amenable and accessible to some and less accessible to others and available to others and made for others, right? And the process of culture in a neighborhood, the culture of a neighborhood is changing, and it's changing in intentional ways. And so I think that arts and culture has to be a central way in which we think about preservation and how to keep a neighborhood thriving, but it's also, in some ways, a threat to a neighborhood that is redeveloping as well, because it's a question of whose culture, right? It's a question of how is culture being used, either to push some groups aside and their history and their culture and their arts and their contributions to a neighborhood aside, and prioritize others who may want a coffee shop and a dog park and an arts gallery and things where the hair supply and the business that has always provided the central goods and services to the neighborhood is being marginalized. So it's really a struggle about whose culture we are going to recognize and value in the process of redevelopment. And so when I think about an equitable development frame for an arts and culture in this question, I think it really is about how do we prioritize what is there and what has, helped this neighborhood to thrive and has been the identity and created a sense of cultural value that is making this neighborhood now attractive. And I think there's a lot of ways in which we can think about the particular ways in which that is used, often used. Like I think about Buford Highway, for instance, as one of the most diverse corridors, or Eden Center as this thriving, Vietnamese place in the country. And oftentimes in redevelopment, that is used as an attraction for redevelopers to come in and capitalize on that culture, and using that as an anchor for the redevelopment that they see that is not meant to benefit those residents. So I think equitable redevelopment flips that on its head and says, if we are the value, if our culture and our contributions are the value, then we are also the beneficiaries of this redevelopment process.
And I mean, who's engaged in the process too? I mean, I think this summer, we had the opportunity to visit different cities with a small business anti-displacement network, and we had a chance to visit the Puerto Rican community in Humboldt Park in Chicago. And I'm gonna steal a tagline from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It said, "This place matters," but I would add, "This place matters to us." And the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, which has been the leading organization there for almost 40 years, they have fought to ensure that they were a part of the redevelopment. And they literally planted the flags. If you go there, it is like the largest Puerto Rican flag. It's metal across the, I think it's Whittier Boulevard, I'm trying to remember. Division Street. You can't miss it. And I think it just speaks to say that this is their community, and it's been hard fought. And they plan to stay there, and they want to be a part of the redevelopment. So I think that speaks to also how the importance of arts and culture, and how important it is about identity and authenticity, and that it's done with them. Since we're right in the neighborhood, I will pick on, because it's early on in my career, in the 1990s, late 90s, working at the National Capital Planning Commission, I was able to see first up the redevelopment of the Gallery Place Chinatown community. If you all have a chance to walk around there, and let me know if you think it's authentic or not. Or as I nickname it, China Block is, putting signs in, Chinese. Or,
I was questioning about that. I was wondering about that. I was like, why is there Chinese characters everywhere?
Is there like the China Gate? So like, is that really authentic?
Dunkin' Donuts.
The Dunkin' Donuts. There is one which was hard fought, which is there is one senior community.
Community center, I
noticed. There's a community center, and there's an apartment building which was almost pushed out from a few years ago. That again, to me, that speaks to, I wouldn't call that necessarily a win for the community. There's a whole other story that could be a whole other case study, but I just kind of wanted to put that out there about, when things are done authentically with the community and to the community. Yeah.
I want to add one point about, in terms of culture and for a place like Buford Highway, it's really important for us to share our cultures within our immigrant. I mean, the immigrant communities want to learn from each other. We all have this commonality. We're all from all over. We speak different languages, but we share in this really, really unique journey of being an immigrant. And I think that the art, utilizing arts and culture as such a comforting engagement tool in a way to really highlight communities. I think it's important, again, because we're this long stretch, to really understand our communities. How are we coexisting together? How do we, respect each other's cultures and what we bring to this area? And so, all of that really, really, really improves in terms of our outreach. We have better outreach. Engagements, because again, we see you, we are speaking your language, we understand that there's nuances, within your languages and sort of the street version of it, like common language. I mean, things like that they really do build that bridge, but it allows us to talk about the other things, such as representation and, it's so important for our communities to show up at meetings. And a lot of them, we're talking about communities with mixed citizenship status, right, or status. And so typically it's the head of the household that is not, that is not a citizen. But when there are so much of a distrust, particularly now. I'm sure you guys have heard about the bill happening in Georgia. And so arts and culture is really a way to start conversations in a comfortable space.
I'd like to add to that, if we can wrap this question up. I think you put it really perfectly. And the idea of immigrant culture, again, not being homogenous, but one commonality being historically disenfranchised from these processes of planning and development. People being really unfamiliar with these questions that they're being asked about their neighborhoods. And business owners and residents, their daily lives are so far away from all of this jargon and bureaucratic language. And so it's not that people don't have a vision, it's that they're not being engaged in the right way. There isn't that kind of trust. And so culture is really comforting, as you're saying. It's a comforting place to say, oh, that does actually matter to me. This is a reason I can be engaged. This makes sense as to why I'm being asked about our neighborhood. Whereas, people aren't thinking about this 5-year plan for a highway as relevant to me.
And those big old boards at City Hall, you're like, what am I looking at?
They're trying to see how am I going to make it to the night, right? Make sure that this day, making money and
but if we
making
say
the
to them,
business survive.
that board is going to take away a legacy place of importance, then it's like, oh, wait a minute. Right. How does this impact my daily life? How does this impact my sense of belonging? And what can I do about it? So those are super important. Yeah.
So I'll just ask one last question, and here's my real curveball. But must this work and how arts and culture shows up, especially for communities that have experienced harm or exclusion or erasure, is there any other way other than resistance? Is this always going to be in response, in reaction to change? What is an alternative, or are we moving? Do you see us moving toward a place where it's not always essentially resistance?
I see that. I experience that. The work that we do, we're a small, mighty team, by the way. I'm one of 2 full-time people, one part-time, and we got a couple of, passionate contract workers. But really, this is a community-driven organization. And my approach has been to get my face into building relationships with those power players, so to speak. We work within 3 municipalities, okay? So I'm working with every council person times 3, every mayor times 3, and certainly on the county level as well. And particularly our school district that has, these schools are Title I schools. They're taking advantage of our ESOL kids, right? You're keeping kids in ESOL, you're lowering the standards. These kids are under this designation from K through 12. Come on. So being intentional and building these, first of all, the relationship, the dialogue, the point of this is what we're all finding, that common goal. The common goal that I've learned is, yes, everybody wants to preserve Buford Highway. Yes, everybody wants it to be multicultural. Yes, yes, yes. How do you do it? Right? They're shaking their heads too, and I'm like, well, aren't you guys the leaders and aren't you guys the government people? You should know this. But we all, so my approach is, it's less the resistance, because what are we resisting, right? I rather work in a space of really, and we've pulled in of course, our academia. We work heavily with Emory University. It's about a hop skip from Buford Highway. I think it's about collaboration. I think it's about getting the right folks, getting to the decision makers, and really creating real impacts. Because the thing is about our communities, we've been lied to a lot. And we lie to each other. Let's be frank about that, right? You have one person speaks English and all of a sudden that person's your mouthpiece. And they've made some mistakes and have not served our communities well. So I think it's for me, it's about collaboration. It's constant fostering of that. It takes a lot of work. This work takes a lot of work. Yeah. And that's why we are grassroots, but we are reaching those grass tops, you know, and I do believe, because of the relationships we have, it's a pitch that you constantly have to keep talking about.
But I would say it's both. I don't know if we want to say resistance, organizing. I think we always have to keep pushing, you know, because I think something that can happen sometimes with like arts and culture, it's like, well, isn't that nice? You know, isn't that pretty? You know, and I think it's more than that. It also is an opportunity to express the cultures, and you know that it's not just the Asian culture, but that or the Latino culture, but that there's, you know, Cuban and Puerto Rican and Dominican and Guatemalan, and there's like variations of that. And I think a lot of times we miss, and you know, and even I've done that. I think my own lesson in that, you know, what may appear to us as maybe not much is actually very significant to the community. And there's a business in a strip shopping center where the landlord is he's really just disinvesting in it. He's just letting it go. And there's a Nigerian restaurant called Queensway that's been hanging on there. They've had all sorts of problems with like code and that the landlord doesn't want to fix. And for the outsider who doesn't really know, they think that maybe, you know, this business that, you know, is hanging on, it's actually a regional draw. There are people that will come from Virginia who will go to that business. So I think part of it in the organizing in the arts and culture is like the landlord wasn't really that interested in us doing placemaking, but the students went ahead and outlined an area with chalk and painted it and built, you know, brought in some tables and chairs temporarily. He wasn't necessarily all into that, but it was, you know, gone, and you know, we did it in one day, but that was a way of building like culture. So a little bit of that, you know, guerrilla style sometimes is necessary that can be done with like placemaking, and you know, maybe you don't get the cooperation of your city leaders, and some banners might happen to appear on some telephone poles, and they tell you they're going to be taken away, but they're still there 8 months later, you know. And I'm like, I'm glad that's still there, even they told us it was going to be gone next month.
You hit the nail on the head with landlords, the property owners. You know, we're going through a case right now, and through this collaboration, the city's like, yes, we support, tear down those, you know, crazy codes and whatever. The landlord is the one that is like, wait a minute, you know, we're trying, you know, and so that's where that resistance comes in, and you kind of have to be a little bit, you know, coming back with, are you going to be the one? That's your story. You're going to be the one that's going to take this place down. They don't want that.
News. Do you want to talk about that in front of the news about how you're letting the business flood because you haven't fixed it? So
We are. Viet Place is a very young group. We're in our 20s, 30s, 40s. We have been called noisy activists by some at the city, and I think it's just funny because, I mean, we're making noise. That's a good thing, and you're threatened by that. And so I think it is essential. I think the way the system works with planning and development is it's almost always going to be reactive, right? Planners will bring a city plan to the community and say, here, what do you think about this thing that we've spent 5 years on that's going to happen now to you? So it is almost always resistance, and it's power building. It's recognizing the state of our community now. You know, Eden Center is such a cultural cornerstone, but some of the infrastructure is falling apart. The landlord has neglected some of these things. Business owners are getting older. Change is inevitable. And so I think part of that response to the reactive nature of the problem is continuing to always build that community power and say, okay, change is coming. What future can we imagine? What will it look like when these businesses succeed to the younger generation? What can we build in response?
Yeah. I would agree. I think it's impossible for most communities of color to imagine existence without resistance.
Yes.
Right? So just the fact that you have an ethnic enclave or a predominantly black or brown neighborhood means that is a culture of resistance to survive, but also to survive amidst constant marginalization and devaluation of that space because of the people who live there. So there is no culture that is not embedded with that culture of resistance in my mind, because it's always fighting the devaluation of when you have more than two Black people together, that is a devalued space in the larger white supremacist society and the larger, culture that puts value in certain places and certain ways. And so I think framing culture without resistance is a little bit problematic. It's like kind of saying that culture is not political.
Yeah.
Culture is politicized in the same way that, that our presence is politicized. And so I feel like the kind of ways in which people are catalyzing culture has to necessarily recognize and reckon with that political nature of the kind of strategies that we're talking about, because it's not just that we're fighting a landlord, it's that we're fighting as a Vietnamese community against a powerful landlord who owns the space for certain reasons. And, so I think it just needs to be sort of contextualized in that way, that many of our strategies, cultural or otherwise, are always political.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. This is just like a small bit of what we could, be exploring, or what we are exploring here. But I wanted to open it up to Q&A. So we have about 15 minutes of Q&A. Thank you.
How about now? Oh, good. Okay. Hi, I'm Rebecca King. I'm a planner with a local government, and you hit on something I'd really love your thoughts on. We do these land use plans, as you say, and we bring them to the community. But there's a lot of thought and research about how to do equitable community engagement. So how should we be doing it? What do you think we should be? As an example, I'm thinking about, we're looking at our comprehensive land use plan, and there's changes we as staff want to make, and we've got a lot of great ideas. But I'm sitting here right now, and I'm like, but whose ideas are they? And how are they going to serve the community, the whole community? And I will say, I think local government employees get a bad rap.
Yeah,
because
they do.
Here's the thing, you're fighting change internally and externally, and that's hard too. And I think, based on my own experience, you also are nervous to open up public input because you have to open it up to everyone. And there's some people you don't actually want to hear from because you know what they're gonna say. And they know who to call. So they're gonna get heard. But what about the people that don't know who to call? How do I design a process to make sure I get that voice elevated to the top?
Good
Can I answer
question.
that? So first of all, yes, some of our biggest allies are city staff, and they do not play. They're like, oh, council, you're on this side. We're working stuff over here. But and this is maybe something you've done already, but I know it's working with nonprofit organizations. Particularly for our communities, our immigrant communities, there's a lot of needs. There's a lot of real needs. We fight food insecurity. Again, that was our health and well-being is a big piece when you're talking about equity, right? And I think COVID was the X-ray that had all these holes. But we can't stop doing because COVID is somewhat at a certain point, right? So I think it's really reaching out and working with those nonprofit organizations that are serving the communities that you want to hear from. Integrate, events with them. Be there at their events. Invest in their events, their outreach.
Yes.
I can't tell you. If you're working with communities where English is not there, even if they speak English, there's so many cultural interpretations, right? So I think it's super, super critical. And you have to also think about literacy rates as well, right? With all of this. So I always say work with the local nonprofits, or at least bring them into the fold of your strategy from a budgetary standard as well.
I agree 110%
Yeah.
with that.
Amen to that.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think, I understand, having worked in local government, from the higher ups, you get given a timeline. This is when we need to have the draft out and the final plan. And so, they talk about collaboration and community engagement, but it still ends up being an afterthought. So I would say that whatever you have scheduled, you need to do twice as much as what you think you need to do. Yeah. And a lot of that isn't the official meetings. It's like, just because you had an event at the library or at the community center and you have nice panels with all these drawings and you put out food and you've invited everyone and expect everyone to come, I'm like, isn't this great? Where is everyone? That's not enough. You really have to make phone calls. You have to visit people in person. If you can co-brand and do an event together with them.
WhatsApp, if you're dealing with community, we're not on email, we're not on, think about technology as a barrier as well. Really understanding that phone tree, old school way, word of mouth is huge in communities as well, right? Mm. Some people are looking at what's a phone tree? Yes, I'm old. But it works. This is how our community, you've got Line in some communities, you got WhatsApp in other communities, you got Kakao in other communities. Utilize, literally go to where they're at. Yeah. Right? And we have to really sharpen your Marcom's strategies. That's where your investment really needs to go into.
Yeah. And the language, you're going to hear that it's like it's expensive. And so I really think that, making sure that you spend, that money spent by local government on the language access and that it actually gets done, and that you have to plan it ahead of time in multiple languages. I mean, as a Spanish speaker and having done this, it's like, well, if we do it in Spanish, it's just enough. It's not. You have to do it in, Vietnamese, Chinese. It's like not just one, but you just
And Google Translate breaks down all the time when you need it.
Yeah, it doesn't work. So
it doesn't work.
Let me add just one point to this, which, we're talking about engagement strategies, and we're talking about how to increase participation in a government-driven process that started because the government decided that it was a good idea to do this thing. So I would say, I teach planners all the time, and I'm like, yeah, you got to go out and you got to plan. Like, that's your job. But where does the planning come from? Yeah. Who decided you needed to plan? Who decided that Eden Center needed a new sector plan?
Not us.
Why did that plan ever come to be, that you needed public input, that you then have problems getting the Vietnamese community involved in the process? Yeah. As opposed to community-driven planning and community control over their own planning processes, which I think is what local government should be aiming for. Yeah. Meaning that the Vietnamese community says, we need something done to our community, and we're willing to participate because it's our future, and that's the future that we imagine. So I think local government planning has a fundamental problem with the way they define the purpose of planning. And I say that as a planning professor who tell my students all the time, think about why you're planning in the first place. And if you don't know why you're planning, go ask the community if they want to plan.
If they want that, yeah.
And Dr. And that was the story of our Chinatown in Atlanta. It was really community driven. It was the fact that we, the generation they didn't realize they had to teach their culture to their children and fight Western culture. I mean, that was a huge thing in our house. And so all of a sudden, it's like, well, wait a minute, we need to create this. No one's going to give you a community center. You're just not. It was literally community built. And we really didn't have the politicians or city leaders so much involved in terms of that engagement and how we built it. So yes, 100%, 100%.
I think on a practical note, just really quickly, and my day job is planning at a local county, so I very much understand. I'm part of staff. I don't make budgetary decisions. My heart and soul is in community organizing, but that's the work I do. And so I think a practical change is to make sure that you're reaching out to tenants and not simply property owners. Mm-hmm. We have all these processes in place to reach out to owners. Yeah. A landlord, really? You think the landlord is going to tell tenants what they should be concerned about? The tenants have real stake, real livelihoods at risk, and real opinions about what they want things to look like. So I think that's a really important change should be made.
I also would go a step further. I mean, I think I've advocated for, and they should, that local governments should engage and pay the local government organizations to do that outreach and engagement that they do it. You know, they do it they end up paying, spending all this extra time doing it, and they don't get paid for it. So I think they should.
Yay, I agree.
Hello, my name is Chris from Black Land Ownership, and I have a question that runs along this track. There seems to be a general theme of bigger, faster, more. Let's scale, not just double in 5 years, but we want 10x. We want to do what tech has done. We want to turn everything into a startup. You all are talking about moving at the speed of trust. You're talking about moving at a speed of community work, which may not be bureaucratic and involves negotiation that's not coercive. All that seems to be in opposition to the general movement or momentum of our country. So how does a person who works in planning or who works in local government inform their coworkers or compatriots that we may have to change our method? We may not go for the biggest, the fastest, the strongest, the most lucrative, when people have fiduciary responsibilities to make it more profitable. How do you all negotiate that or reconcile that?
I think that goes back to the resistance factor, frankly. I mean, I can think of, the work that I'm doing work in Miami in a Dominican neighborhood. And, if you've all seen Miami's into big cryptocurrency, and we want to be the next Silicon Valley by the water and this and that. And so they think that is the way to help the community economically develop. And that's not necessarily what they want. They want their small businesses to thrive. So it really is about telling that story about how these businesses matter and that resistance, that small business is just as much of an economic contributor and an engine to Dade County as some of these other, quote unquote, economic drivers. So I think it's telling that story, and it is organizing. I think that's a part of it. Even if it is, building at the speed of trust is slow. It takes a long time.
Yeah, and I think there's also like a fundamental question about like why neighborhoods change so quickly, right? And part of that reason is because there's a profit capability, and then there's a lot of policies that go into making that neighborhood more valuable. There's new transit that's put in, there's tax incentives for businesses to come in, there's housing subsidies that are put in for new development. And so part of that resistance strategy is actually slowing some of those things down, right? It's asking about the fundamentals of the land contract, if you will, and finding points of leverage to slow some of those processes down or stop them altogether. And I think it's also asking the question about why.
Yes.
I'm thinking about Eden Center again, because I remember having a conversation with a planner in Falls Church about the Eden Center, and they're like, oh yeah, we reached out, nobody's responding, we got the sector plan, we gotta get it moving. I was like, why do you have to get it moving? Why do you not have time for community engagement? Why is this process so time determinate? Who's telling you it must be done then, and who can you not tell that you haven't reached out to the right people and that you don't have community buy-in for your plan? And they're like, oh, yeah, we'll think about that. And they went back and they thought about that. And they ended up doing stuff at Eden Center to get more community engagement and working with Viet Place Collective, because it's not, the sense of urgency is really a profit-driven sense of urgency. It is not a sense of urgency a political sense of urgency. It is not a sense of urgency that's driven by the communities. And the community does have power to slow those processes down.
And to ask even what I think ostensibly may seem like community-driven. I mean, I can remember one story in Miami in the Alapata neighborhood, the redevelopment of the library. I'm like, well, we're redeveloping the library with a community, and we have a nonprofit that's going to help build affordable housing. And then when they started digging a little bit more, no one had ever heard of this nonprofit. No one knew who the executive director was of this nonprofit and who the developers were behind it. So you had to do some digging, and yes, so asking why and slowing it down is part of it. It's like, well, you're saying that it's community driven, but none of the organizations in this community were even asked to be a part of that process.
And I just want to add one more, because that's a really great question. I think in this terms of resistance, the community development teams within a city, the community engagement teams within a city, I think it's really pressuring, having that relationship with them and holding that point of accountability. Who are you representing when you call yourself a community development person or job title? And I know that sometimes we've pushed really hard where the community development person says, you know what, you're right, and I quit, because they didn't feel like they had the actual power. So then it becomes about looking into these city organizations in terms of your teams and your staffs, and how much empowerment are you really giving these titles?
You all covered it really wonderfully.
Do you have any closing words? Oh, sorry.
There's some question.
Do we want to take one more question? Do we have time for that?
Okay. Hello. Good morning. Over here. Good morning. Hi. David Stephen. I work with the Transit Workforce Center, and we represent the federal government in providing technical assistance for frontline workers that do public transit. One of the things that we always talk to agencies about as we're providing technical assistance is that if you are truly committed to creating diversity in your workforce, then you will employ those people that come from the communities where you are working on those projects. So my question to you all is there an example that you all know of, or what work can be done so that when communities are flagged for development, that you are taking the people that live in those communities to provide those employment opportunities, because that's probably the best way to create authentic engagement to get the community involved and to make sure that they're serving the needs of the people that live in those communities.
One of the things that we are advocating for, and this is a very small scale, is one position at the City of Falls Church for them to hire a Vietnamese outreach specialist that comes from our community, so that it's not just a translator or interpreter that is there at these city meetings to speak in Vietnamese, but someone who actually is engaged, has connections with people, is connected to what the community needs. And so pushing jurisdiction cities to hire people who specialize in that kind of outreach that come from the community, I think is a very powerful lever to tap into that historically untapped resource of outreach.
I would say it's also engaging with the workforce organizations too. I mean, I think there's a whole lot of organizing to do with that. I think it's something that's a whole line of work with the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, and there's so much to do. Because you do have to create that pipeline, right? It's not just enough to put a bunch of advertisements and say that we distribute it to the community and that all of a sudden you're going to get like 10 hires. It's like, well, do those jobs match the skills that are in the community? And if not, then how do you build that so that when you have those projects, they can actually apply for those jobs. They have an actual chance for success. So yeah, it's important. There's a lot of work to do there for sure.
And importantly, this is all under attack by the Supreme Court right now. And so I applaud you for still continuing as a federal agency to sort of think about strategies to employ those workers that are most impacted. But we have to be aware that this is all
That's right.
under major attack right now, and that the resistance to these kind of policies needs to be at all levels as well.
And I think connecting with labor organizations is a huge part of that. There are lots of Asian American, Latino labor organizations that are really plugged into the community, what we can provide, and what we're fighting for.
Well, on that note, I think we'll conclude.
I did want to make a pitch to some of the folks here who may not have signed up for a tour that we will be taking a tour of Eden Center. So if you haven't signed up, I think there are a few spots left on that to visit this amazing place in Falls Church, Virginia. So I wanted to thank our panelists one more time. It's been incredible.